abusive partners give you these little breadcrumbs where it's horrible, but then they're wonderful and they do show change. And when we go back to date one or month one, you think about how they used to be, and you don't want to give up just yet, because the picture they painted in the beginning is usually so amazing that you really hope, like, wow, I hope we look back and this whole phase was just something we can laugh about, but we lived happily ever after.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is episode 95. And this week, I'm excited to share with you the conversation that I had with my guest, Ashley Bendiksen. Ashley is a national speaker, activist, and author whose mission it is to bring justice, advocacy, and healing to survivors. The conversation was both tragic and inspiring. The tragic part is the horrific and repeated emotional, physical, and sexual abuse she endured for over 6 years. The inspiring part is how she recognized the abuse and turned it into a career of speaking about all of it to connect, educate, and instigate change in our society. I truly enjoyed my time with Ashley, and I think you'll understand why as you listen to this powerful episode. Here's Ashley. Ashley Bendiksen, it's truly an honor to have you as a guest on this show.
Thank you, Dave. I'm glad to be here.
And so my audience knows, I ran across Ashley on Instagram and saw some of the posts that she does about her presentations and what she talks about. I decided to reach out to her and see if she'd be willing to be a guest on this show. It wasn't until maybe 15, 20 minutes into looking at her posts that I had this thought, I've seen Ashley before somewhere, or I know of her from something. And during our pre-recording conversation last week, talking about it, and I told her that, she said, well, maybe it's from a presentation I did, or maybe we were in the same place at the same time, or, oh, wait, do you know Eric Barreras? And I was, absolutely, I know Eric Barreras. And then it dawned on me. Eric had recommended Ashley to me several months ago when I asked him to be on the show, and he was going through some big changes in his personal and professional life and gave me a list of people that he thought would be great guests on the show, and Ashley was one of those people, and I just hadn't gotten down that list far enough to reach out to her back then ran into her on Instagram. So Ashley, it's really awesome to actually make this connection and have you on the show. Thank you again. Ashley, I'm going to ask you to start off by telling about yourself, giving some history before we get into your sexual assault story and horrific experiences that you've lived through. If you would, give us some background on who Ashley Bendiksen is.
It's always the toughest question, isn't it? Who are you? I think to not define myself by my work. I grew up on the south coast of Massachusetts. I am a born and raised New Englander. I now live in Rhode Island. I've always lived by the ocean, and that's certainly where I live in Newport. I am by the sea, and it is my healing place. I grew up in a small town. Like many young people, it took me many years to figure out my path. And unfortunately, along that path, I faced some adversity and challenges, and ultimately it changed the trajectory of my life. I had some kind of semblance of what I thought my career might be, what I might do someday. I always knew I wanted to help people. But it wasn't until I went through my experience with domestic violence and sexual assault that I really felt compelled to take this on as my mission in life. And so today, all these many years later, this is my expertise. I've taken my backstory. I felt compelled to learn, not just in my own healing, but to want to raise awareness for others. And so I now speak full time on these topics. The bulk of my work is in schools and universities, but I also train law enforcement, workplaces, social services workers. I've just turned this into a business. That's what I'm doing today. I speak, I'm fired up and excited to talk about these topics. Like I feel this rallying cry to raise awareness. And when I'm not speaking, I love to write. I've been a freelance journalist on these topics for many years. I wrote a book. I like to play music. I'm teaching myself piano. So
Wow.
many other facets to who I am outside of my story and my work too.
I love hearing all of that. That's awesome. It's amazing to me that you have been able to not only utilize your experience for teaching and educating others on the nuances and the dynamics and idiosyncrasies of domestic violence and sexual assault, but that you have branched out into so many different areas is all part of why I wanted you to be on this show. Can we talk about how you know Eric Barreras and your experience with him? Because I had quite a great experience knowing him and being introduced to him when I worked for the Army. Talk to us a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, this is the power of the internet. I met Eric initially through LinkedIn. Sometimes when you're working in this space, it's a very isolating space. You're kind of always fired up and excited when you meet someone else who's doing similar mission-driven work. And so I had somehow come across Eric. I'm not sure if I was searching for people in the abuse prevention space, but we one day set up a call just to get to know each other, instantly clicked. And back then, it was kind of the origins of what used to be Difference Makers 10 Strong, where we wanted to build this little network of speakers and trainers that specialized in assault prevention and bystander intervention as a prevention model. So he and I ended up speaking in person together. In the years that followed, we spoke at a major conference in Las Vegas. We worked together to speak on some military bases, and I got to meet several other individuals that we brought into this little collective of speakers. He's an amazing person and passionate, became a very quick friend and colleague in this whole space.
With ditto with me. I met him through the Army, as I mentioned. He was a special agent working for the Criminal Investigative Division of the Army. At the time, I was training and consulting with the Army as a highly qualified expert, and he went through one of my courses. We had lots of conversations together, and he was just in the initial phases of wanting to start Difference Makers 10 Strong. I'm so glad that he made the connection with you, because that's ultimately how you and I are connected. Here we are today. I'm appreciative of him and of you. Ashley, let's go into that really difficult aspect of what got you where you are today in your business. And if you'd be willing to, tell us what you're able to about your experience with domestic violence and sexual assault.
For me, these were issues that first showed up in my adolescence. I came from a very loving, seemingly healthy, normal two-parent home. I had never been exposed to domestic violence. I had a very narrow view of what that looked like and who it impacted, and certainly not something I thought could happen to me, let alone a teenager. But it was my very first dating relationship that, like most dating relationships, especially young ones, started out exciting and fun, and there were no red flags, no warning signs. I was 14 years old, a freshman, and just really enjoying this kind of new chapter, right? High school was exciting. I had this new boyfriend, but unfortunately, it took a turn. He began to change, and kind of without seeing it at the time, without realizing what was happening, he was starting to become controlling, very verbally and emotionally harmful to me, just the things that he would say, the criticism. And also, our relationship was just consumed by constant expectations of intimacy and pressure, to the point where eventually it just got so severe, all of these behaviors, that by the time I was 14 and a half or so, very early into this relationship, I was experiencing classic signs of dating abuse, but also sexual abuse. And I think there's many facets to it that make it complex and confusing. But I think one thing that I never thought of in terms of sexual assault is that a partner could do this. I think, like many people, you see the grisly headlines, you watch the TV shows, and sexual assault is a stranger in the alley, right? The cliche. But I didn't think that that's something your partner could do to you, or someone that says they cares about you could do those things. So I tried to explain it away, but I was undergoing frequent, recurring, forced sexual intimacy by this first boyfriend. And it was the beginning of, sadly, a 6-year cycle of abusive relationships, abusive partners, assaults by other individuals. It just kind of became all I knew. And I never really fully knew I was a victim until I one day stumbled across information, and it was eye-opening. My life was in bullet points. That defined my adolescence from ages 14 to 20. With those experiences came all of the other fallout, the struggling with my mental health, with unhealthy coping, academically struggling. My life just kind of fell apart because of it.
What were you doing to utilize whatever coping mechanisms to manage all of what was going on?
Whether you're young or not, it can feel very isolating. It can feel confusing. And usually in that space, you don't always talk to people or ask for advice. It can feel embarrassing. Like I always said, it felt like my story was so unique and so complex. And even if I tried to explain it, no one could get it because it wasn't always bad. And there's so many factors. I became very reclusive. I isolated myself in many ways. With that came just a lot of depression, a lot of me being in my head asking all these unhelpful questions. Why is this happening to me? I'm just meant to suffer. Everyone else seems to be doing fine. So I was kind of living in this headspace of just a lot of negative self-talk, which turned into depression, which also turned into a lot of anxiety too. Every day, behaviorally, I was trying to feel accepted, to feel like my life wasn't what it actually was. So I wore a lot of masks. I was constantly trying to shape myself, mold myself so that either my boyfriend would be nicer to me or the bullies at school wouldn't be perpetuating these rumors, or I would try to act a certain way with my parents. And it gets very stressful. I was also lashing out. Part of feeling powerless is you try to exhibit power in other ways. And so I was fighting with my parents some days, running out of the house, making destructive decisions. As far as like you asked about unhealthy coping tools, I made a lot of the classic choices. I was turning to substances. I was a kid who never wanted to drink until I felt painfully sad. So I stole alcohol from my parents and had my first drink. I was turning to other substances, being a teenager, experimenting with different things. I had really disordered eating habits because part of the abuse, I had a really low self-esteem and a very warped image of my body and how I looked. So I had very, very unhealthy eating habits. My physical health was all over the place. And also, I was self-harming. The depression brought on a lot of suicidal ideations. And then even academically, I wasn't doing well. I went from being a straight A student to suddenly failing classes because things like homework felt very unimportant or they weren't at the top of the list. My whole world changed. I often say that it's like Ashley disappeared one day. I was lost to myself. The girl I used to be didn't exist anymore. I was just in survival mode, trying to do everything I could to either pretend it didn't exist and try to fit in. It was just this constant cycle. Everything just fell apart because of it.
Yeah. One of the main aspects of domestic violence is the cycle of violence. And I wondered if you could speak to that.
Once you're removed from these relationships, sometimes you can go back to date two when there was a little subtle red flag. And at the time it seemed sweet. And then in retrospect, you see what it led to. So yes, if somebody was abusive on date one or month one, you probably wouldn't want to date them. So it does show up subtly and steadily at the same time. For many partners, especially in my relationship, some of those early warning signs, they were disguised as love and affection. Someone wants to spend all of their time with me. They're checking in nonstop, calling and texting. And suddenly you realize that that was just them trying to have constant control and knowing where I was and isolating me from talking to anyone else. So it definitely occurred in my relationships. When I tell my story, there's two big ones that I think provide the best teachable moments. And it was that relationship at 14. And then I had another one when I was 18, when I had left high school and went to college. And I would say that 18-year-old relationship is really where I saw the textbook abuse. He had a lot of mood swings. He tended to get really angry easily. Part of dating someone is you get to know their past, right? So my partner at that time, he had a really rough upbringing. His dad had died. So a lot of times when these issues would show up, I would think, well, that's because of his trauma. It's because of his childhood. I'm going to have empathy. I'm going to be patient and help him work through this. But all those little incidents of trying to have empathy, every incident got worse and worse and worse. And eventually there was a day where he didn't put his hands on me, but he did get physically aggressive when angry. I can remember the first time he got out of a moving car while I was trying to talk to him, or slammed the door really loud, or punched a wall. And that's really when it started. For most of us, those are obvious red flags. So then we have the conversation. We try to tell them, I didn't like this. What you did wasn't okay. And that's when they then apologize. They recognize it. You're right. I shouldn't have acted that way. I'm so sorry. My partner would say, I'm just so afraid to lose you. I promise you'll never see that side of me ever again. And then we'd have a great day or two. But then that cycle starts right over, like you said. Now it's just a matter of time before I can just look at my partner and tell something is off and it's about to be another incident. It just goes on and on. And it's really tough to see it when you're in it, because you find ways to very easily rationalize and justify all of it.
I'm so appreciative of your openness and willingness to talk about these things for two reasons. Number one, I know that there are listeners in my audience who are currently experiencing very similar situations and experiences. It's good for them to hear that they're not alone and to have that feeling of community and understanding. The other aspect of this is that there's people in the audience who may have never experienced any of this. And I think the education that you're providing is so helpful in spreading the word and putting out there that we need to be doing things that solve these situations. My whole drive is to bring down the prevalence rate. And to bring down the prevalence rate, we have to talk about it. We have to expose it, and we have to point out the dynamics and the people who are perpetrating these types of lifestyles and belief systems and values that are actually harming and manipulating and controlling other people. I'm very appreciative of the fact that you've gone into as much detail about this and talked about it the way you have, because it's spot on with the message that I'm trying to get out there. There are people, though, Ashley, and I know you know this because you've experienced it yourself, who wonder, well, why didn't you just leave him? Why did you stay so long? Why this and why that? It is victim blaming. And I really am a proponent of stopping the victim blaming and making people more educated and realize that it's not a matter of just leaving. That's terrifying, and it's also dangerous. Are you able to talk to us about those dynamics?
Yeah, I could sit here like any victim or survivor and list thousands of reasons that I didn't just leave. I think if I had to pinpoint probably the top ones, first and foremost, I did not think I was a victim, nor did I think that this was domestic violence. I thought this is something else. This is just a complex relationship. You go back to marriage vows, right? Through thick and thin, good and bad. And that's what I believed love was, that even in the bad times, you stay and you work through it. And ours is just a little bit more challenging. So I didn't think that this was domestic violence. I just thought it was our unique relationship. So that was part of it. The second one is really just this feeling of hope, hoping that if you give it enough time, things will get better. It always seems like there's some new issue to work through. And abusive partners give you these little breadcrumbs where it's horrible, but then they're wonderful and they do show change. And when we go back to date one or month one, you think about how they used to be, and you don't want to give up just yet, because the picture they painted in the beginning is usually so amazing that you really hope, like, wow, I hope we look back and this whole phase was just something we can laugh about, but we lived happily ever after. That's the second one. And then I think the third reason I didn't just leave is that some days it was just emotionally easier to just stay, to just get through the night and hope that there wasn't an issue or the police called or some incident. It was almost easier just to stay and try to get through each day than to try to undergo this huge effort of breaking up and all the what ifs and what if they don't respond well. Sometimes it's easier just to be in management mode with the relationship. Those are the big ones for me, but it's hard. It's hard to leave any relationship, let alone an abusive partner.
Absolutely.
And for many victims, they've tried to leave and maybe failed at it. And that just adds to that feeling of helplessness and powerlessness of, I've tried to break up with them, but nothing I've done or said or attempted has worked, right? They somehow just bring you right back in. So it can feel really defeating. So it's tough to leave.
Yeah, very much so. But you did get out. You got out not once, not twice, but I think you said that there were other relationships you were in that involved some of the same dynamics and issues, but you came to a realization that this has to stop, that you were repeating this pattern of going into a relationship with somebody who wasn't good for you. What are you able to tell us about that realization that you made that you needed to make a major change?
I think for a very long time, the abuse was a very large aspect of my life, but I still had my hand in a few pots, whether that's high school, having my family's home. I still had some even thin sense of stability. By the time I was 18, 19, 20 in that college relationship, it dismantled every aspect of my life. Being out on my own in the world, having less connections to family, to home. Basically, when it ended, I no longer had a connection to my family anymore. I had no friends. My bank account had been drained by him. He forced me to drop out of college. So abuse went from being a big piece of my life to all that my life was defined by. I had nothing left without it. And it brought me to a lot of rock bottoms. Dropping out of college was a big one. Having no money. We became homeless for a short while together. We spent an entire summer living out of my car. Things just got consistently worse. I actually attempted to end the relationship because he was growing more consistently aggressive, physically breaking things. I started to feel worried about my physical safety. And unfortunately, he did retaliate. After I tried to end the relationship, he did attack me. So that was the only way I was able to fully escape, was through the court system, through him getting arrested. But I think it was at that moment when I literally left the courthouse thinking about the fact that I had nothing left. I couldn't just continue on with my life. I couldn't just go back to classes in the fall and just kind of keep ignoring it. The reality of my life was staring me in the face because I had nothing left. Even my abusive partner, I was alone in the world. I had no identity. And I've often said that I think worse than eventually learning that I was experiencing abuse was that I woke up and had no idea who I was. It was all just gone. It was an eye-opening moment. It was just this come to full reality. It's almost like I had this bird's eye view of the last 6 years of my life and just saw that suddenly it was all gone. And I knew in that moment I had to change things. And in a weird twist, my brain somehow looked at this and felt motivated, almost because this was like an ultimate blank slate, a blank canvas. I thought, my family doesn't even know that I'm outside of a courthouse right now. They don't know what happened to me. I don't have school. No one cares what I do in this moment. But I saw that as an opportunity to really start fresh. And that little spark of inspiration just shifted my thoughts. Brene Brown writes about the emotions of awe and wonder, and how sometimes awe and wonder can create the strongest, most internal transformative feelings. And I think in that moment, in a weird way, my sudden freedom from that abusive partner and from the last 6 years of my life and this idea that I could start fresh, I was in awe of what freedom suddenly felt like again. And it changed my mind and it changed my life. So I can't say that the healing journey was easy, but my perspective and how I viewed things changed, and that changed everything. And I remember it was about a week later, I somehow stumbled across this quote: "The greatest revenge is massive success." And it just resonated with me so much because I knew that my abusive ex-partner wanted me to struggle in life, hoped that if he heard about me 6 months later, he wanted to hear that I was doing horrible without him. And I just had this like fight in me to want to prove him wrong, right? Like in a weird way, it was a positive, but I thought, if he or any of them ever hear about me ever again, it better be because I'm doing amazing things and that I'm successful in spite of it all. It just that mindset shift and wanting more for my life and believing that I could somehow figure it out just changed my whole path moving forward. And I've somehow strongly kept pointing straight ahead ever since.
I love that. That's an amazing aspect of this story. And I'm not an analyst, I'm not a therapist, but I can well imagine that the point that you were at when that realization came to you probably took you back to who you were before any of this started as a 14-year-old, 13-year-old. Your worldview was probably one of motivation and wanting to accomplish something in life anyway. And all of a sudden you're in a position where you can do that. Am I right at all in terms of who you were deep down inside before all of this assault and abuse and sexual assault took place?
I think so. I'm still returning to that little girl, right? I'm still every day remembering who she was and bringing her back into my life. Yeah, I think honestly, adolescence is a really tough time. And I knew that a lot of me had disappeared. I think I became very quickly aware that I never felt insecure or questioned my looks or my worth until that first boyfriend. And so I wanted to get back to the curiosity I had about the world, my belief that I could be anything and do anything. I've always been an ambitious kid. It's like I used to dream of being an Olympic figure skater, a US gymnast. I had all these big dreams. And suddenly at the age of 20, I just saw myself as having zero value. And that contrast, I wanted to get back to believing that there was more for me. So it was just one day at a time, kind of returning to her for sure.
Yeah. Tell us about that healing journey. So once that realization is made, there were steps you had to take. There were processes you had to go through. And healing doesn't come easy. And we've said it numerous times on this show that healing isn't linear. It's an up and down process that really is difficult to maneuver. But you've done such an amazing job of maneuvering that. Are you able to talk to us about that healing journey and what steps you took and how you are where you are today in terms of, man, being an international figure in getting this story out?
For me, like many new survivors, the first steps were really just establishing safety and security, just very basic needs, having a safe place to live, not being worried that I'd be found. That was really important, being able to meet my basic needs of paying rent for a roof over my head and being able to eat each day and having a job. So that was kind of the first steps. What's interesting is I never accessed professional help or support. This was a while ago, let's say 15 to 20 years ago, and the response is much better these days than it was then. I was kind of given a stack of papers when I left the courthouse. I received a pamphlet about a domestic violence shelter. That's how I saw it. I didn't need a shelter. I wasn't homeless, wanted to get an apartment and figure the rest out. So I didn't realize that there was free counseling, advocacy, or any of that. So somehow I just figured it out on my own each day. So once I kind of established safety and a place to live, I still didn't have a car. And so at the time, I was walking to and from my job. It was about an hour walk there, an hour walk back. It was a restaurant. It was late nights walking home. And what's interesting is during those walks, I see this as like the next phase of my healing. I was very introspective. I was alone, walking myself to work, building up this feeling of self-reliance, of being able to take care of myself. Walking home at night, I would mentally prepare and build my alertness if someone was to come at me. I was hyper aware, hyper vigilant, but I was building up this feeling of fearlessness, of power, of just getting back into my body, of believing I could defend myself, almost conditioning myself to fear in a simple way. And so I was building just self-reliance by just taking care of myself and spending time alone. And during the first, 6 months to a year, I was reading a lot, learning about abuse. I was journaling and writing and just reading other personal development books. And just, I guess I would define that now as a phase of self-care and really just going within and also educating myself on abuse. And between those two things, the path just became easier from that point on. One thing I remembered feeling as I was learning about abuse was realizing, my gosh, this is textbook. There's language and definitions, and my story wasn't unique at all. It's in bullet points on this piece of paper right here. And I wanted to raise awareness. So as I was kind of going through this whole healing process, I looked up my local domestic violence agency because I wanted to just volunteer and somehow help spread the word even more. And that was the big catalyst for the rest of my chapter, is that once I volunteered with them, they asked me if I would speak at an event. I had never told my story before, but I spoke and the response was amazing. Other people disclosed. I saw the power of having dialogue around this. And from that day on, I started speaking as much as I could, volunteering wherever I could, getting involved in advocacy and social justice work. And then eventually I thought about going back to school for criminal justice. And that really was the beginning of everything. There's a lot of research on healing. And one that I've always really loved came out of this book, Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. She writes about finding a survivor mission, and she talks about how there's been so many studies of women, for example, who got involved in the anti-rape movement had some of the most powerful healing. And I really believe that by telling my story, integrating it, using it to help others, that's been the strongest factor in my own healing. The beginning, safety and self-care, but then expanding it beyond myself has been instrumental.
That is so awesome in terms of emphasizing what this show is about. And the phrase you used is making a dialogue out of this, talking about it and exposing it, because I find that there is so much healing in people who come on this show and share their story. It's self-healing. It's part of how they are healing themselves, but they know, and I believe this is part of why you agreed to come on this show, that in hearing other people's stories of interpersonal violence, that it's educational to the point where they realize they're part of a community and there's strength in community. There's strength in talking about this. And it goes back to what I said earlier. It's all part of diminishing the prevalence in our society of interpersonal violence, domestic violence, sex assault, rape. We have to talk about these things. Mm-hmm. Are you able to talk to us a little bit more about what your mission is now and how it is that you are doing what you're doing, what it is that you're doing in terms of public presentations?
Yeah, so this is now my full-time work. I mostly travel the US on a pretty weekly basis, speaking to all ages. Personally, my passion is speaking to students, one, because my story is so relevant, but also because this is where most of these issues begin to show up. And also adolescents experience abuse at higher rates than any other demographic. And what I've also learned is that this is a unique age to also reach those who might become abusive. One thing that I think I do really well is I don't target anyone. As you've mentioned already, this is not an issue that just impacts girls, females. Anyone can be a victim. I have many male students and students of all genders come up and thank me and disclose their stories. But I've even had students of all genders, men and boys included, disclose that after hearing me speak, they think that they might be abusive and asking for resources. I always tell them that they're at an age where you're learning how to be a good partner. And a lot of it is emotional management. So if I can help a 14-year-old boy, let's say, who tends to feel insecure and jealous and take his anger out in controlling ways, to get help to manage those emotions better, to me, that is like the potential for that sliver of possible prevention of that student getting help now too, not just the student who's already experienced abuse. And that's something I'm really passionate about. On the other side of that coin, I love training adults who work with youth, because a huge piece of my story is the fact that no adults recognize the red flags. From my parents to teachers, the school nurse, there were plenty of opportunities for intervention, and I truly believe that if someone would have intervened way back then, made me feel comfortable, offered me support, it might have changed this whole story. I really love doing that. And then, of course, I love all the audiences. I love law enforcement. I like talking to them because now I'm so far removed from my story that it's not too sensitive for me to go into these conversations and talk about how challenging responding to domestic violence calls can be, how difficult sometimes a victim can be. I was that difficult victim. There's so many angles to talk about this issue, but like you said, I think my mission, just like yours is to speak about this issue, the more we normalize this and talk about it, the easier it will be to find solutions or to change things or to empower people to come forward. And I think just personally, when I think of my work today, something I'm trying to do is make these topics relevant and interesting and relatable. Sometimes the term domestic violence is a turnoff. Sexual assault is a turnoff. But if I talk about my first boyfriend and how I wasn't ready for something and he forced me into it, there's a lot of people that can relate to that story. So I try to find a more modern way to talk about these issues. I talk about emotionally abusive partners versus calling someone's partner a batterer. So there's ways we can start to talk about these issues where it's more approachable and accessible for people, because sadly, once we do it in a very relatable, genuine way, so many people relate. And these issues are everywhere, but we have to use real stories, real language, and present them in a really authentic way for people to relate to it.
What you're talking about is so powerful and so impactful and so good. I just want to stop and say thank you for everything that you're doing. Are you able to talk about what the future holds, where you're going with this, what you anticipate things looking like in the next year, 2 years, 5 years?
Yeah, well, the entrepreneur in me has an endless list of things I'd like to do. But I am definitely in the process of putting together a outline vision for my book. I would love to write a part memoir, part self-help book on healing after abuse. Even though we've alluded to the fact that I've healed quite well, there have still been remnants of the trauma over the years that I've not processed, not integrated. A book on healing can be invaluable to people, in many different ways. So I look forward to writing that book. I also would like to host a podcast at some point. I'm hoping to speak on more stages, continuing to expand my impact. I think one thing that keeps me up at night is this idea that I can change individual lives, and I know that I do that, and that's amazing. But I also have this big vision of impacting huge change. And I know in order to do that, I need this critical mass of people. I need so many people to be adopting this language, to be spreading the message, to be, making copies of the billboard and putting it up in their communities. Ask myself, how do I reach more people? Is that more YouTube videos? Is that the podcast? Is that a book? That's always my compass is, will this allow me to reach more people and hopefully engage them, not just in their own personal development, but as allies? I want more people to say, yeah, I'll talk about this with you, Ashley, because I don't want to do this work alone. I want, to find all the people. So yes, just like you. So that keeps me up at night is, how do I just build that momentum by reaching more people?
You are on an amazing path, and I know that what you're talking about is going to come to fruition. And I understand exactly what you're talking about in wanting to reach more people. And I commend you for all of what you're doing and for your vision and for what you've accomplished so far, because I know it's changing lives, and I appreciate that. I know you are impacting the prevalence rate, and I know you are saving lives. So don't stop. It's amazing what you're doing.
And likewise.
Well, thank you. Ashley, it's been an honor talking to you. I know I could talk to you probably another 2 or 3 hours easily about all of this, and I hope that there's an opportunity that we can do this again. I would very much appreciate having you back on this show. Yeah, and hearing about the progress that you're making.
I always want to be an ongoing resource, so I would just encourage anyone who's listening who wants to connect or ask a question or wants to ask me something that I didn't address on this episode to reach out. I think my best platforms are LinkedIn and Instagram. I'm very responsive on those. My website also works, ashleybendiksen.com. You can read some blog posts, there's resources, there's information on my speeches if anybody wants a presentation for their local school. That's kind of a great place just to learn more and contact me.
Absolutely, and that's part of why I wanted you here too. I want to promote what you're doing, and I will include the information that you've just referenced in the episode notes for this episode of Ashley Bendiksen, and would appreciate you sending me anything else that you want this audience to read about or hear about or see. Thank you, Ashley.
All right, Dave, thank you.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I hope you got as much out of listening to this episode with Ashley as I did in having this conversation. Thank you, Ashley, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to sit with me and share your amazing experiences, goals, and future plans. And thank you to my audience for taking the time and listening. If you're interested in having Ashley come speak at your school, business, or agency, or if you'd just like to drop her a note of appreciation, Ashley's contact information is in the episode notes, and I know Ashley would appreciate hearing from you. And my request is that you subscribe to this podcast, rate it, and tell all of your friends and family about it in order to help this podcast grow. It's important that we normalize these conversations to eliminate the rape, sexual assault, and interpersonal violence culture in our society. Participating in this show is one way to do that. Another is to start by believing when it comes to listening or supporting a victim or survivor of interpersonal violence, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape, sexual assault, or interpersonal violence. We'll see you next week.